The unexpected problem. As Paul stood at the threshold of the airlock, staring into the room full of humans, a knot tightened in his chest. He had always been a scientist, a thinker, but this was different. This wasn't about calculations or data points. This was about people, about beings who could be entirely different from anything he had ever known. His mind raced, struggling to wrap around the enormity of what was about to unfold. The humans were standing there, waiting for him. And yet, despite their overwhelming presence, they were silent, curious but not hostile. He had prepared himself for fear, for confusion, even anger, but not this. Their faces seemed to express wonder, not suspicion. He had expected their eyes to hold the same coldness that had been reflected in the surveys, but instead, their eyes were warm and filled with anticipation. As the door to the airlock opened fully, Paul hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. His translator, a small device nestled in his pocket, buzzed faintly. He'd been told it would make communication easy. After all, the technology had been built to bridge the gap between the myriad of species that called the stars home. But even as the translator clicked to life, he felt a creeping doubt. The humans were not waiting in rigid lines or taking military stances. They seemed relaxed. Some stood with their hands behind their backs, while others casually leaned against the walls. There was no aggression, no hostility, just a sort of quiet curiosity. It was disorienting. One of the humans, a woman, maybe in her late 30s, stepped forward. Her expression was mixed, confusion with a touch of amusement. She squinted as if trying to understand what was before her. "Little baby space otters," she exclaimed, her voice loud and clear, and a burst of laughter followed her words. Paul blinked, unsure whether his translator had malfunctioned or whether he had misinterpreted the tone. Space otters, he thought, trying to make sense of it. The woman's words had been unexpected, and yet they seemed to melt some of the tension in the room. A few humans around her chuckled, their smiles genuine, their posture relaxed. To Paul's astonishment, the humans didn't appear to be afraid. No, they were fascinated. It was as if they had seen something entirely new, and they were curious, eager to learn more. Paul's chest tightened as he realized something he hadn't fully considered before. These humans were not just explorers in space. They were explorers of ideas, of life, of connections. Then, before Paul could even respond, one of his younglings, a tiny creature no larger than a human child, darted from his arms and began scrambling across the floor of the room. Paul's heart leaped into his throat as he saw it, but before he could move, another human, a young man, reacted faster than Paul could have expected. The human kneeled, his face lighting up with joy. With gentle hands, he scooped up the youngling, holding it close to his face. "The fur is so soft," he exclaimed, laughing, as if this was the most wonderful thing that had ever happened to him. Paul stood frozen in place, a mix of awe and confusion flooding his mind. The human wasn't recoiling. He wasn't frightened. He was playing. He was interacting with his child as though it were a pet, not a potential threat. The other humans, too, began to gather around, marveling at Paul's younglings. Some reached out to gently stroke their fur, their movements cautious but not hesitant. Is this really happening? Paul wondered, his mind racing. He had spent his life learning about the cold, impersonal systems of government, about the science of communication, and the art of diplomacy. Yet here he was, standing on a strange world, in front of strange beings, and nothing in his training seemed to apply. These humans, so different from anything he had imagined, were treating his children like treasured companions rather than strange creatures from another world. Paul watched, still unsure how to proceed. His translator buzzed in his pocket again. But this time, he didn't reach for it. He was too overwhelmed, too fascinated by what he was seeing. The humans continued to interact with his younglings, with no sign of the fear or discomfort he had expected. They were simply engaging. There was no barrier of suspicion, no sign of mistrust. It was as though they had no preconceptions about who he and his species were. The more Pol observed, the more he realized how extraordinary this was. The human general, an imposing figure whose face was marked with a long scar, a remnant of past conflicts, moved forward. Pol braced himself for what could be a stern reprimand or an expression of disbelief. But to his surprise, the general didn't speak of war or fear. Instead, he gently pushed one of the younglings away from his chest, brushing it aside with surprising tenderness. Despite the gruff exterior, the general's actions spoke volumes. There was a kindness there, an acceptance. "This is quite the welcome, isn't it?" the general said, looking down at the pup now sitting calmly at his feet. His voice was gravelly, but there was something surprisingly soft about his tone. "Yes," Pol replied, still unsure how to react. "This is not what I expected." He had come here, fearing for the safety of his people and wondering how they would ever connect with a species so seemingly unpredictable. But the humans were showing him something different, a side of themselves that he hadn't anticipated. They weren't the cold, calculating machines of war that the Mola had described. They weren't the terrifyingly powerful force that other species had warned about. They were simply different. As Pol and the humans continued their interaction, the atmosphere shifted again. It wasn't about political posturing or rigid formalities. It was about connection, about curiosity, about the unspoken understanding that they were all part of a much bigger picture, a picture that Pol had never seen before. His heart, which had been tight with anxiety, slowly began to loosen. Maybe, just maybe, these humans were the key to the galaxy's future. Maybe together, they could overcome the crisis that lay ahead. But first, Pol needed to understand them, just as they were beginning to understand him. The unknowns of the universe stretched out before them, and in that moment, Pol realized that the path ahead wouldn't be defined by the rigid plans and theories of his people. It would be defined by the willingness to embrace the unexpected, to allow curiosity and creativity to lead the way forward. As the meeting continued, the words of the Mola science director echoed in his mind. "Trust me, this will work better than any other option." For the first time, Pol believed it. A new beginning. Pol had always been a methodical thinker, one who approached every problem with calculated precision. He had spent years studying diplomacy and interspecies relations, applying his mind to understand the complexities of the galaxy. But standing in front of the humans, watching them interact with his younglings, he realized that no amount of training could have prepared him for this. The humans continued to fuss over his pups, their eyes lighting up as the little creatures bounded across the room. They were mesmerized by the sight, laughing and exclaiming in delight as one of the pups playfully nipped at a human soldier's boot. It was all so unexpected. Pol had prepared himself for fear, for alienation, but instead he found nothing but curiosity and fascination. The young human woman who had first spoken to him, the one who had referred to his pups as little baby space otters, now stood at his side. She smiled, her eyes filled with a mix of amusement and genuine interest. "They're adorable," she said, her voice gentle. "Are they always so playful?" Pol was still trying to process what was happening, trying to make sense of this strange new reality. He had expected the humans to view his species as something alien, something to be feared or studied. But instead, they seemed to accept them with open arms, as if they had always been a part of their world. "They are curious," Pol answered slowly, his voice still tentative. "They've never encountered a species like yours before." The woman's smile deepened, and she looked down at one of the pups, who was now climbing up her leg with surprising speed. "Curiosity is a good thing. It's how we learn." Pol blinked. Curiosity. It was a concept he understood, but hearing it spoken by a human, a species he had been told was driven by their own kind of instinctual aggression and dominance, was disorienting. He had always believed that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations were those that operated with cold logic, that used their superior intellect to dictate the terms of engagement. But these humans were different. They operated on a level that Pol had never considered, a level of emotional intelligence, compassion, and understanding that seemed to transcend logic. The general, who had been watching the interactions with a stoic expression, finally spoke up. His voice, gravelly and deep, cut through the light chatter in the room. "I've fought in battles all over this galaxy," he said, his gaze sweeping over the group. "I've seen countless species, countless worlds. But I've never seen anything like this before. I've never seen beings this open, this willing to connect." Pol turned to the general, his brow furrowing. "Is that a good thing?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. The general chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "It's different, but maybe different is what we need right now." It was a simple response, but it carried weight. Pol felt the truth in it. Maybe the galaxy didn't need more cold calculation. Maybe it needed something else, something more human. As the meeting continued, Pol found himself slowly letting go of his initial fears. The humans weren't just embracing his species, they were engaging with them. They weren't seeking to dominate or control. Instead, they were learning. They were eager to understand the Shirali way of life, their struggles, their triumphs, and their hopes for the future. And Pol, for the first time in his life, realized that he was part of something larger than himself, something that could change the course of history. Pol glanced around the room, noticing how the humans had started to interact with his younglings in different ways. Some crouched down to their level, speaking to them in soft tones, while others mimicked the movements of the pups, trying to communicate through playful gestures. The soldiers, who had been so intimidating upon arrival, were now sitting on the floor, letting the pups crawl over them. One human, a woman with short hair and a gentle smile, was even feeding one of the younglings a small treat, her hand trembling slightly as she offered it. She was clearly unsure, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. She wanted to connect. "This is remarkable," Pol whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He hadn't expected any of this, least of all the humans' openness and willingness to connect on such a personal level. He had anticipated a long and difficult road ahead, filled with misunderstandings, awkward silences, and perhaps even conflict. But now, as he watched the humans interact with his species, he began to feel a glimmer of hope. After what seemed like hours of playful exchanges and gentle interactions, the general stood, his posture straightening as he addressed the group. "I believe it's time we discuss more important matters," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "We need to understand how we can work together to overcome the challenges facing both our species." Pol nodded, his heart still racing. He had been thrown into this situation with little preparation, but now he realized that the humans were far more than just a new species to meet. They were allies. They were equals in this vast galaxy, and it was time to start building something together. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time since leaving his home, Pol felt a sense of excitement. Maybe they could build something extraordinary, something that would bridge the gaps between their two species and create a new future for the galaxy. It wouldn't be easy, but with the humans by his side, Pol was beginning to believe that anything was possible. Building bridges. The humans, still gathered in the room, shifted their attention from Pol's younglings to the more pressing matter at hand. Pol, though still somewhat stunned by the ease with which the humans had embraced his species, knew that it was time to move forward. The conversation had begun to take a new direction, one that would determine the course of not only his people's future, but also humanity's place in the larger galactic community. "We're not here just to observe," the general said, his voice breaking through the hum of excitement and curiosity that filled the air. "We've already seen the potential for cooperation. Now, we need to start figuring out how we can actually make this work. How can we help each other?" The question hung in the air, a challenge that Pol hadn't expected to face so soon. He had imagined that diplomacy would unfold in measured steps, with careful discussions and slow progress. But the humans were different. They were direct. They wanted action. They weren't interested in idle conversation. They wanted results. Paul's mind raced, but he forced himself to focus. The mullah had given him detailed reports about the humans, how their species had been a force of both creation and destruction, their history marked by both war and cooperation. They had been quick to colonize new worlds, build vast civilizations, and develop technologies that surpassed anything Paul's people had ever dreamed of. But they also had a reputation for being unpredictable, a species that could both inspire awe and fear in equal measure. The more Paul learned about the humans, the more he realized that they were, in many ways, a mirror of his own species. They had their flaws, their complexities, but they also had an undeniable drive to explore, to grow, and to connect. And it was that drive that Paul now saw in the eyes of the humans in front of him. They were eager to learn. They were eager to build. It's not just about understanding each other's cultures, Paul said, his voice firm as he stepped forward. We have to find practical ways to cooperate. We need to share our knowledge and technology, our resources, and our expertise. The challenges we face are not small. We must prepare for the worst and hope for the best. The general nodded, his eyes narrowing as he processed Paul's words. I agree, he said. We're already thinking about how to integrate Shirali technologies with human engineering. The ocean habitats you've developed are fascinating, and our marine biologists are already excited about the potential there. We've got resources too, raw materials, energy sources, expertise in fields like terraforming and space travel. Paul was stunned. He had expected them to be cautious, to hold back their technologies and knowledge. But the humans were already thinking in terms of collaboration, of mutual benefit. It was a stark contrast to what he had experienced with other species, who were always more interested in what they could take than what they could give. We've got a lot to work out, the general continued, turning to one of his aides. But we can't let fear or uncertainty stop us. We need to focus on the bigger picture, if we're going to survive the coming challenges. If we're going to make it as a unified galaxy, we need to start acting like allies. Paul took a deep breath, the weight of his responsibility settling on his shoulders. His people had always been cautious, hesitant to trust other species, especially when it came to matters of technology. But with the humans, he realized that caution might no longer be enough. They were offering something greater than a simple exchange of resources or knowledge. They were offering trust. The humans, in their own way, were showing him that cooperation didn't always have to be a calculated transaction. It could be an act of faith, a willingness to embrace the unknown and face it together. That was the real key to moving forward. The galaxy wasn't just a place for survival. It was a place for growth, for unity, and for the future. As the meeting progressed, Paul found himself more and more at ease with the humans. They were pragmatic, but there was an underlying warmth in their approach. They weren't just trying to solve problems. They were building relationships, forging bonds that would last for generations. Later that day, as Paul walked through the human space station, he was approached by Ashley, the young human who had been so fascinated with his pups. She was carrying one of his younglings in her arms, her face lit up with a kind of wonder that Paul had never seen before. I think she likes you, Ashley said, smiling down at the tiny creature nestled in her arms. Paul chuckled softly, his initial discomfort fading. She seems to be quite fond of you as well. Ashley grinned. Well, they're just so full of energy. But you know, I think there's something special about them. It's not just their curiosity. It's the way they approach everything. They don't hold back. They don't judge. They just live. Maybe we could learn something from that. Paul couldn't help but nod. He had never thought about his species in that way. The Shirali were curious, yes, but they were also cautious. They took their time to understand, to adapt, to survive. But perhaps the human way, this unrestrained enthusiasm and willingness to embrace the unknown, was something his people could learn from. Maybe we can learn from each other, Paul said, his voice filled with a newfound understanding. We've spent so much time looking inward, focusing on our own survival. But maybe it's time we started looking outward, together. Ashley's eyes lit up. Exactly. And we're in this together now, right? I mean, we've already shared so much. Our technologies, our knowledge, and we're just getting started. There's so much more we can do if we keep this going. Paul smiled, feeling the weight of his responsibility ease just a little. It was no longer about what his people could gain from this alliance. It was about what they could achieve together. And for the first time since leaving his home, Paul believed that this partnership might be the key to a new chapter in the galaxy's history. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the path forward wouldn't be walked alone. The Shorali and humanity, two species once worlds apart, were now united in a shared goal: to build, to explore, and to thrive. Together, they would face the challenges of the galaxy, not as rivals, but as allies. A new dawn of cooperation. Days turned into weeks as Paul continued to work alongside the humans, each day bringing new surprises, challenges, and moments of awe. The initial shock of first contact had subsided, replaced by the slow, steady process of integration and understanding. Paul, once filled with apprehension, was now beginning to see a different side of humanity, one that was more than just capable, but remarkably adaptable, driven by an unyielding desire to push boundaries and build something extraordinary. In the early stages of their cooperation, Paul had been taken aback by the humans' enthusiasm. It wasn't just their willingness to embrace new technologies or ideas. It was their urgency, their relentless drive to innovate. For the Shorali, change came slowly. Every new idea had to be tested, scrutinized, and then adopted after careful consideration. But the humans approached every new challenge with a sense of excitement, as if the very act of creating something new was its own reward. One of the first joint projects that Paul worked on with the humans was the creation of a new kind of oceanic habitat. The Shorali had long lived beneath the waves, designing structures that could withstand the crushing depths of their home world. But the humans, with their ingenuity, had introduced new concepts that Paul had never considered: floating platforms powered by renewable energy, vast underwater cities designed not just for survival, but for thriving in harmony with the surrounding environment. The project was ambitious, and Paul found himself constantly amazed by the scale of the humans' imagination. They didn't just want to build. They wanted to revolutionize the way their species interacted with the oceans. As Paul watched them work, his doubts began to fade. The humans weren't just offering assistance, they were reshaping the future, and they were doing it with a sense of urgency that Paul had never experienced before. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. As with any large-scale collaboration, tensions arose. The Shorali, known for their careful, methodical approach, sometimes found themselves at odds with the humans' fast-paced, bold ideas. At times, Paul felt like he was caught between two worlds: his own people, who preferred to move slowly and deliberately, and the humans, whose desire for progress sometimes felt overwhelming. It wasn't long before a disagreement surfaced. The Shorali engineers, who had spent years developing underwater technology, believed that the floating platforms the humans were proposing were too risky. They feared that the structures would be vulnerable to storms or even the unpredictable behavior of oceanic creatures. The humans, on the other hand, were convinced that their designs were the key to unlocking the potential of ocean living: floating cities that could expand and contract as needed, providing new homes and resources for both their species. Paul, caught in the middle, found himself in a difficult position. He respected both sides of the argument. The Shorali were cautious by nature, and their fears were not unfounded. But the humans were persistent, confident that their innovations would change everything. Paul knew that the only way forward was to find a compromise, to merge the best of both worlds. He convened a meeting between the Shorali engineers and their human counterparts, hoping to find common ground. The room was tense as the two groups presented their ideas, their voices rising with frustration. Paul could see the anger on the faces of the Shorali engineers, their hesitation growing with each new proposal from the humans. And yet, the humans remained calm, even enthusiastic, as they explained their designs and the potential they held. As the meeting wore on, Paul felt the weight of the moment. This was more than just a technical disagreement. It was a test of their ability to work together, to overcome the differences that separated them, and build something truly extraordinary. He couldn't afford to let the project fail. The future of the galaxy, of both the Shorali and the humans, depended on their ability to find common ground. And then something unexpected happened. One of the human engineers, a woman named Maya, stood up. She was quiet at first, her face contemplative, but then she spoke, her voice steady, but filled with conviction. "I get it," Maya said, her eyes scanning the room. "The Shorali are right to be cautious. We've been moving too fast, assuming that we know what's best. But what if we take a step back? What if we listen to each other, really listen, and figure out a way to combine our strengths?" For a moment, there was silence in the room. Paul couldn't believe what he was hearing. Maya, the same woman who had been pushing for bold, radical designs just moments before, was now proposing a middle ground. She wasn't just acknowledging the concerns of the Shorali, she was embracing them. Her willingness to compromise, to meet halfway, was a turning point in the conversation. The Shorali engineers looked at each other, surprised by Maya's humility. Slowly, one of them, an older engineer named Zur, nodded. "Perhaps we can incorporate elements of your design into our own," he said, his voice tentative but open. "If we use your floating platforms as a base, we can reinforce them with our underwater structures. It might be the solution we've been looking for." The humans, too, seemed to soften at the suggestion. Paul could see the shift in the room. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about finding a way to create something that both sides could be proud of, something that would stand as a testament to their cooperation. Over the next few weeks, the teams worked together tirelessly, combining their ideas and expertise. The result was a new kind of habitat, one that merged the best of both species' technologies. The floating platforms provided mobility and adaptability, while the Shorali's underwater engineering reinforced the structures, ensuring they could withstand the harshest conditions. It was a perfect balance of innovation and caution, of speed and precision. As Paul stood on the edge of the completed structure, looking out over the vast ocean, he felt a deep sense of pride. The city before him wasn't just a marvel of technology. It was a symbol of what humanity and the Shorali could achieve together. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. It was the beginning of something much larger. The humans had shown him that progress didn't always have to come at the expense of caution. Sometimes, the best ideas were born from compromise, from the willingness to listen to one another and find common ground. The humans had taught him that cooperation wasn't just about aligning goals. It was about respecting differences, embracing new perspectives, and working toward a shared vision. And as Paul looked out over the shimmering waters, he knew that this was only the beginning. Together, the Shorali and humans would build not just cities, but a future, one where trust, understanding, and mutual respect would guide them as they explored the stars. The galaxy had changed, and Paul had become a part of something greater than he had ever imagined. The uncharted territory of trust. In the weeks that followed the completion of the first joint oceanic habitat, the atmosphere between the humans and the Shorali shifted significantly. What had begun as cautious curiosity and tentative cooperation had evolved into a deeper, more meaningful relationship. Paul had found himself growing not only as a diplomat, but as a person. The humans, with their unflagging optimism and boundless creativity, had ignited something within him, a sense of possibility he had never thought possible. However, despite the progress they had made, the road ahead was far from clear. While the first habitat was a success, there was a growing sense that the true test of this alliance had yet to come. The galaxy was vast, and there were many unknowns. Political tensions simmered among other alien species, and not all were as willing to embrace humanity's sudden rise. The mullah had been adamant that humans could either be allies or a threat, but they had underestimated just how deeply humanity could integrate into the galactic tapestry. Now, Pol and his human counterparts were faced with the daunting task of ensuring their alliance wasn't just a fleeting partnership, but one that would withstand the challenges of an uncertain galaxy. It was late one evening when Pol found himself alone in his quarters, staring out the window of the human space station. The stars shimmered in the distance, and the soft hum of the station seemed to lull him into deep thought. It had been a long day filled with technical briefings, diplomatic discussions, and most surprisingly, moments of shared laughter with his human colleagues. They had made great strides, but Pol could not shake the feeling that the real challenge was yet to come. The galaxy was full of factions, each with their own agendas, their own fears, and their own motives. The mullah, though they had helped set the stage for the first contact, were still wary of humanity's rise. There were whispers among some species that humanity's rapid development was a threat to the established order of the galaxy, and if that wasn't enough, there were even rumors of a rogue faction in the galaxy, a group that sought to disrupt the fragile peace by pitting species against one another. Suddenly, the soft chime of a communicator broke through his thoughts. Pol turned and saw the familiar face of Ashley, the young human engineer who had been instrumental in the success of the ocean habitat. She had become a good friend during the course of their collaboration, and her enthusiasm had been a constant source of energy. The hologram flickered to life as she appeared, her face lit up with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Pol," she said, her voice urgent, "there's something you need to see. You might want to meet with the others in the command center." The concern in her voice sent a jolt of worry through Pol. Without hesitation, he quickly activated his communicator, stepping out of his quarters and making his way to the command center. As he arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The human officers and Shirelli diplomats were gathered around a large display screen, their faces serious. Ashley stood near the front, pointing at the screen. "We've intercepted a transmission," she said, her eyes wide. "It's coming from a faction in the Outer Rim, one we've had little contact with until now. They've learned about our alliance, and they're not happy about it." Pol's heart sank as he watched the flickering transmission. The message was garbled and distorted, but there was no mistaking the tone. It was filled with threats and distrust. The speaker, a member of a militaristic alien race that had long been a force of instability in the galaxy, was clearly warning both the Shirelli and the humans that their cooperation would not be tolerated. "We're watching you," the voice on the transmission growled. "If you continue down this path, you will face the consequences. The galaxy has a balance. Humans and Shirelli will not be allowed to disrupt that balance." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Pol felt a chill run through him. For the first time since he had met the humans, doubt crept into his mind. He had come to believe that the greatest strength of their alliance was in their unity, but now this shadowy threat loomed over them, threatening to shatter everything they had worked for. The room was filled with murmurs as the group processed the transmission. Pol could see the uncertainty on the faces of his fellow diplomats, and he understood their fear. The galaxy was full of complex politics, and a coalition between humans and Shirelli could upset the delicate balance of power. But as he looked around at the humans in the room, something unexpected happened. They weren't panicked. They weren't retreating into their doubts. They were gathering, discussing, planning. "I think we need to be proactive," Ashley said, her voice steady. "We can't let these threats dictate how we move forward. We've come too far to turn back now." Her words were simple, but they resonated deeply with Pol. The humans didn't flinch in the face of adversity. They'd met it head-on. It was this resilience that had brought humanity to the forefront of galactic affairs in the first place. It was this same resilience that Pol would need to tap into if they were to survive the storm that was brewing on the horizon. The room fell into a tense silence as Pol took a step forward. "We can't let fear guide our actions," he said. "This transmission is nothing more than an attempt to divide us. If we let it, we'll lose everything we've built." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. We must show the galaxy that humanity and Shirali are stronger together. If we stand united, no faction can break us. We must prepare ourselves for what lies ahead, but we cannot allow our enemies to decide our fate. We must continue to build, to cooperate, and to trust in each other. This is not just about survival. It's about proving that unity can overcome any force, no matter how powerful. Ashley and the others nodded, their expressions hardening with resolve. We'll start by reaching out to other species who may be sympathetic to our cause, one of the human officers suggested. We need to form alliances to strengthen our position before they strike. We can also increase our defenses, another officer added, but not in a way that shows weakness. We can't make the first move. Let them think we're vulnerable, and they'll come to us. Let's be prepared, but let's also keep pushing forward with our projects. Pol's heart swelled with a sense of pride. These humans, who had once seemed like an unpredictable species, were now showing the very traits that Pol had come to admire in his own people: adaptability, courage, and the ability to think ahead. He had been worried about the potential of conflict, but now, standing side by side with these humans, he realized that it wasn't fear that would drive their actions. It was a shared determination to succeed. In the following days, the alliance between the Shirali and the humans strengthened. They increased their outreach to sympathetic species and began bolstering their defenses, preparing for whatever might come next. The project they had started, the merging of Shirali and human technologies, continued to grow, a beacon of what cooperation could achieve. The galaxy, despite the threats and uncertainty, was beginning to see the seeds of something new, a new order, one where trust and unity might finally take precedence over fear and division. Pol knew there was still much to be done. The galaxy was vast and filled with dangers, and the road ahead would not be easy. But as he stood alongside the humans, watching the stars stretch out before them, he felt a renewed sense of hope. Together, they would face the challenges of the galaxy, not as separate species, but as allies. And perhaps they would prove to the galaxy that even in the darkest of times, trust could light the way forward.